I'd like to welcome you all here and to welcome Rebbetzen Treblow, who will speak to us on Rochel, Leah and Sister Leah.
Right, okay, so one of my slight problems.
I'm sorry. To speak a bit louder.
Right, can you hear me in? Gosh, don't like shouting, believe it or not. Yeah, we're good. I'm getting a nod. Okay, that's great. Okay, wonderful. Okay, Miss Wilson, do you happen to have a chumash somewhere easily accessible?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm gonna move this back a little bit, because otherwise it's really distracting. Okay, so I'm just going to kick off while we get there, and there might be the odd pause while I find my place. Now, the wonderful thing about Mrs. Wolfson, she's very, very organized, and she asks for titles before I've even thought what I'm going to say. So I could slightly end up digressing from the topic, because as I was sort of thinking how I wanted to put this together, like, no, actually, I want to do something else. So if you're expecting something about sisterly love, I'm really sorry, you might not get that. But Be'ezras Hashem, we will have a lovely time, and we will talk about something to do with Rochel and Leah, who, as we know, turn up in this week's parish. Now, the drawback, not the drawback, it's wonderful, actually. Thank you so much. Gosh, it's really heavy. Thank you. The drawback is not a drawback as such. The issue you have when you're talking about anything in the parish is you never know where to start, because everything is connected somehow to something else, right? But you can't have just talk about Rochel and Leah without also talking about Esav and Yaakov. And talk about Esav and Yaakov, you have to talk about, you can go backwards and backwards and backwards, and you also end up having to go forwards and forwards and forwards, because everything is connected. And if we want to make sure that we don't see the Torah as just a nice book of fairy stories, which obviously it isn't, we want to make sure we're really relating to it. We have to so we are going to go a couple of times in kind of circles, if that's okay. We start off with what we might start off with Rochel and Leah. We might have to go a bit backwards, we might have to go a bit forwards, or sort of dot around a little bit. So let's do, ladies, a little bit, I guess, of revision. Okay, I'm going to start with Yitzchak and Rivka, right? Our father Yitzchak, his wife Rivka, and they wait a long time for children, and they have twins, right? They have twins called Esav and Yaakov, and the pasuk tells us, I'm not going to quote every word inside, it's going to take us too long, but we know that the boys are brought up the same way. They're twins, but they're brought up identically till bar mitzvah, and at that point they seem to develop their own track. Okay, we have Esav, who is an ish sada, he goes into the fields, and we have Yaakov, who's yeshev ayhalim, he likes to be in the tent. We know, so I'm just going to skim through this. We have a story where Esav sells his bachira, so somehow he sells being the firstborn, whatever that means. And many, many years later, when Yitzchak is about to die, I know we know this, I'm just skimming through it, right? When Yitzchak is about to die, he wants to bless his sons. Now, a blessing is, these who think I was just saying something nice. A blessing is not just saying, it can be saying something nice. A blessing is bringing out, I'm not going to go into it now, it's not today's share. A blessing is about bringing out the talents and the qualities and the good points of the other person. You can't bless something that's not there already. Okay, that's just a concept which we're not going to get into in depth today, but it is there.
Could I just interrupt?
Go on, yes, a shout.
Until bar mitzvah they were brought up the same.
Yeah.
But even before birth, they displayed opposite.
They did, right? So do you want me to say that again? So somebody said, well, even before birth, they seem to have opposite traits, and that is right. That is what the pasuk tells us. However, what we're seeing, and actually Rav Hirsch says that as well. Rav Hirsch says, having known that there's slightly opposite traits, really, perhaps their upbringing should have been different, and someone should, and maybe, on our level, we can look at Yitzchak and Rivka and say, well, maybe they should have varied their chinuch depending on the child. But that's quite a deep look. I remember learning that many, many, many years ago. I'm not telling you how many years ago. And I was in SEM, and in the SEM with us was a Yerushalmi girl. She was, we're quite used to questioning everything and thinking about things. It's a very sort of English American way of doing things, but she was straight down the line. Her family had been living in Yerushalayim for years. She was as simple in a nice way and straightforward and posh as they come. And she was so distressed when we learned that reverse. Like, how can you possibly criticize, etc., etc. So yeah, there is that. I don't want to go too much into that bit because it's a separate story, but it's a really good point. Okay, so either way, at this point they go different, and they have some brachas, and we know that Rivka realizes that Yaakov should probably have both sets of brachas. He should have Esav's brachas and Yaakov and his own brachas, and she sends them in to get them. And what's interesting, we'll get to it later, is the brachas he gets. So the bracha that was going to go to Esav and ends up with Yaakov, he is told should get the dew of the heavens, and mishmaneha is the fat things of the land, lots of corn. It's quite, you know, corn and grain and good things and wine and all the rest of it. Okay. And when later on, Yaakov gets his, no, missed a bit, sorry. Yitzchak finds out, he gets extremely upset. And what is probably the saddest line in the whole Torah is, Barcheni gam ani avi, give me a bracha too. So he gets another bracha, right? He also gets a bracha very, very similar. Also gets a bracha mishmane haaretz, the fat of the land, and the dew of the heavens, just a different way around. And he's told, by your sword shall you live. Okay. Yaakov in the end has to run away, okay, and gets another bracha before he goes. And off he goes. And that was the end of last week's parsha. Okay, so far so good. Gets two altogether. Esav's one and Yaakov's own one, and in the middle, Esav gets another one, which is similar to the first one Yaakov got, because that would have been Esav's bracha. Right. Okay, so now Yaakov's got two, bear that in mind, one about the fat and the dew and the wine, and one of his own, which is more about his own personal growth and spirituality. We will get back to it. Okay, next one. Meanwhile, right, so if you're filming this, you'd have like a sort of split screen while all that's going on, okay? Far away in Padan Aram, which is a long way away, where Rivka comes from, two young ladies are growing up, two girls are growing up, Rochel and Leah, right? Leah's the oldest, Rochel's a bit younger. And we know that all the pasuk tells us when, yeah, sorry, I've got to get Yaakov there. You have to give me a chance. He's away for 14 years. So I've got to turn quite a few pages, 14 years worth of pages. He goes away. When Yaakov gets there, I don't know. First, he sees Rochel. He meets Rochel, who is very beautiful. I read that story. He sees her coming, and he manages to roll a stone off a well. We're not going to go into that now, but it's useful to know that we find out quite early that Rochel is very beautiful. Pasuk tells us, when we find out them Leah, that in Leah Rachot, the eyes of Leah were tender, were softer, and Rachel she was beautiful to look at, the Yefas Mara, and beautiful of appearance. Okay, and we know that Yaakov loves Rachel. He works for her for 7 years. We know this, right? I'm just skimming through it. He works for her for 7 years. On the wedding night, Lavan does a bit of a swap, right? And the Midrash tells us how did this swap work? Leah's covered in a veil, so he couldn't see her. Yaakov had a suspicion, the Midrash tells us, looking at deeply into the pasuk. Midrash tells us Yaakov had a bit of a suspicion that Lavan was going to try and pull a trick like this one. So he had arranged some code words, I guess, some signs, we call them the simanim, with Rochel Imenu. It wasn't Rochel Imenu, it was with Rochel, that it was going to be their sort of code so they would know each other. And the Midrash tells us, and this is where we're going to start, that Rochel gave those signs to her sister. That's what the Midrash tells us. Even the basics, looking at the pasuk, Rochel does not say anything. So, you know, we always go on about how Sadekas Rochel was, and she was, but I know my kids always say, what about Leah? Because she was, you know, like, imagine in that situation, she's getting married to somebody knowing that if he would know in advance, he wouldn't be very happy about it. So it's a very, everybody seems to be suffering a lot over that. And it looks, more or less everyone who's concerned, totally, utterly incomprehensible. So hold that one in mind. It doesn't seem to make any sense what's going on. Next morning, pasuk says, in the morning, it was Leah. Now, what the Midrash tells us is a conversation between Yaakov and Leah, which we'll get back to, right? Conversation goes like this. Yaakov says to Leah, remember, she's given him all these simanim, so the whole night he thought she was Rachel. Yaakov says to Leah, you cheat, you daughter of a cheat, how could you do such a thing? And she says, it's a very interesting line in the Midrash, she says, no such thing as a barber, like a hairdresser, right, without an apprentice. And she says, well, you know, and she says, you deceived your father, pretending to be your brother, so we deceived you with me looking like Rachel. Now, if you think about it, this is the tzaddik who's the father of all the Jewish people, and the woman who's going to be the mother of Mashiach, and the mother of the priests, and the mother of everything else. It's a bit of a childish conversation to have, like a bit of a bickering going on, you know, like, yes, okay, it's already hard and difficult to understand and all the rest of it, but it does seem a little bit petty. Well, you did it first, well, you did it second. Bit of it does seem a little bit strange like that. So we're going to have to look into this a little bit deeper. And I'm going to just say that the good bits of what I say this evening, like the rubbish is all my own, but the good bits are from a set of shiurim from Rebbetzen Treblow, who's a teacher in Yerushalayim. She was my lesson sen, and a lot of the good bits are coming from her. But let's move on a little bit. And one of the things that we notice also is it's not only is the whole bickering not seem strange, but look what Rochel has done. She doesn't actually give up being married to Yaakov because she marries him later on. what she's given up is being the main wife. Right? There's one main wife. There's a wife who's going to be the ancestor of Mashiach. There's a wife who's going to be the ancestor of the Kehanim and the priests, right? That's what she's given up. And not only that, my daughter, you asked me about my daughter, she comes in, you can't believe what I just said. This is really interesting, she told me. She said that the halacha is like this: the avos, our fathers had to keep the Torah in Eretz Yisrael. The Torah hasn't actually officially been given yet. They kept the Torah in Eretz Yisrael. They didn't have to keep Torah outside Eretz Yisrael. The Torah tells us a man can't marry two sisters. So while he was in the town of Lavan, while he was outside Eretz Yisrael, he could marry two sisters. But when he goes back to Eretz Yisrael, which he knew he was going to have to do, he could only have one wife. So one of them would have to die on the way. And because Rochel before, right, I'll tell my daughter, she's like, Emma, you've got to understand. She called me, she's like, so Rochel knows, somehow or other knows all of this. Because she's the second wife, she's going to be temporary.
Can I just tell we had
Yeah.
to share a few weeks ago, I said this, but also I think Rochel had a dream, because you know about it, or what's called Rochel death.
Yeah.
That it says somewhere in the Torah that Leah that she said to Yaakov, Leah is going to have to lie with you. And what she meant to say was the woman who spoke on the cave Rochel event.
Yeah.
And she said, when she said lie with her, she knew that Hashem was going to lie in heaven with him.
Yeah.
And Rochel knew that she'd go down the way to
Right. So Rochel knew that she would not be able to be buried with Yaakov. Yeah, exactly right. So she's given up a huge amount. Okay. And all the time, Leah's working with this and living with this. So you've got Leah and Rochel, and they're both giving up something. Leah spent the rest of her life being married and knowing that she wasn't actually the first choice. And Rachel spending the rest of what she's got left, knowing that she could have been the first. It's a very kind of complicated thing. Let's fast forward, about 1,000 years, I'm good at numbers, right? Again, it's a medrash based on the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, right? There's a pasukim in the Navi Yirmiyahu where he talks about Rachel Imenu crying, right? You've probably heard this, crying from her cave, from her tomb in Beis Lechem. And Hashem says to her, stop crying and I'll bring your children back. Underneath that, the medrash tells us that somewhere in Shamayim, there's a kind of, how we understand, a conversation going on. All of the others go to Kadosh Baruch Hu and say, this is Klal Yisrael going into Galus, right? We're going to be exiled. All of the Imahas are calling and they say, or the others, are saying, Abraham says, I did this, I went through fire for you. Hashem says, well, they've managed to cancel that Zuchas out. That Zuchas isn't going to work anymore. And Yitzchak says, I went through the Akedah, and Hashem says, well, they've used up that. So every possible merit, we've used up, goes all the way through until we get to Rochel. Rochel says to Kadosh Baruch Hu something like, and I don't have it exactly in front of you, I kept quiet and I managed. Why can't you keep quiet and you manage? You're Hashem. Okay, really strange images. Like, what is this? Well, I could do it. Why can't you? Again, if we look at it at very face value, what our holy ancestors seem to be saying seems to be a bit kind of like tit for tat, like childlike. Right. So obviously, there's got to be more to it than that. Okay. To understand this properly, let me just ask you, do we have, it's 40 minutes, 45 minutes? How are we doing? We'll see, right, see when I finally run out of steam and the coffee wears off. Okay, need to go back. We're going to get a bit philosophical today, ladies. We need to go all the way back, consider this, all the way back to Bereshis, right? So the creation of the world. Before the creation of the world, there is only Hashem. We can't really understand that, but that's what we got. There's only a Kadosh Baruch Hu who is one. As soon as, and I know it's late, so if I say this wrong or if you're not getting it because you're asleep, that's fine, but let's try anyway. As soon as the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants to give to the world, therefore there has to be something to give to. So you're automatically talking, in order for the world to go anywhere, you need more than one being, right? You need Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the Kabbalah, which I don't understand at all, talks about Tzimtzum. There's two things. Then we start Bereshis. So first there's nothing, or there's just Hashem, and then you've got light and dark, and then you've got the sky and the earth and the seas, and it's always, every piece of creation is separating out more and more things. Okay, so as soon as you start, the difference, okay, just generalizing massively over here, the difference between, I hate saying spirituality, it sounds a bit sort of 21st century, but you know what I mean? The difference between ruchnius, okay, if I use that word, which is, and gashmius is ruchnius, the closer you are to one, the closer you are to ruchnius. The further away from that you are, the more splitting and division you're getting, the more closer you are to gashmius. Okay, now that doesn't mean one's wrong or right, it just means that's the reality we're living in. And so if you look through a lot of what, for example, a yid has to do in the world, it's all about different things and trying to balance out differences. So we're not supposed to always be angry, we're not supposed to always be calm, there's a time for everything. It's about finding that finding different things and finding that balance between them and pulling them together. That's why one of the holiest relationships in the world is marriage, because you're taking two totally separate beings that were totally, utterly different in possibly every way you can think of and bringing them together. Okay, you with me? So that's where that holiness comes in. Lots of other things to look at. Example, right? When we go to the excuses, so the bracha v'shayatzar, and at the end we say, Rafecha basar umafli la'asais, he does wonders. Says the Shulchan Aruch, which doesn't normally get philosophical knowledge, it's just halacha. Says one of the wonders is that you can actually get a spiritual neshama in a physical body. That doesn't seem to make sense. One is purely external and out and animal, and it seems like it shouldn't work. The world is full of things that opposites that shouldn't really work, and that's one of the wonders, and that's one of our jobs in the world. Right, you with me so far? Because we got a little bit complicated there. Okay, so sometimes, okay, we have our out. So let's go with that particular separation. We've got our inside, our spiritual, our ruchniya sense, and our outside. So we're already got two things going on for every single person. One of the places you see that most, by the way, is eyes. You know, like in English, they say the eyes are the windows to the soul, right? You can, when we say I see, we mean two totally different things. Or I'm seeing something in front of me, which means, help me with the physics here, people, right? The light bounces off something, and I don't know how it works, right? Okay, like, you know, you see actually an object. But when I say, oh, I see, I mean, I understand, which is something in my mind, which I guess is about the closest we're going to get to think about neshamas in that way. So you can, you know, this, I can understand something on the inside, or I can see something on the outside, but we actually use the same word for both. Remember what we said about eyes. It's going to come in useful in a little bit, okay? Right, so now we're going to fast forward another 1500 years. Okay, so we've done the creation of the world. We're going to go back to Esav and Yaakov, right? Ideally, in an ideal world, we're bringing two things together, the physical side, the Gashmi side, and the Ruchni side. And you might have heard this idea before. Okay, what was ideally going to happen was something like this. Esav was going to be, it says an Ish Sadeh, he goes out to the fields. Now, the field is not a bad place. Yitzchak Avinu davens mincha, we daven mincha because Yitzchak went out to pray in a field, right? The place where the Beis Hamikdash is referred to as a field. So field isn't a bad place, but it's a physical place, right? You're doing things within the world. Yaakov was going to be an Ish Tam, he was Yeshev Halem, he was going to be in a tent, meaning he was inside, looking more at the Ruchni side of things. And what was ideally going to happen, which Yitzchak wanted to happen, ideally was going to happen, and you might have heard this idea before, is Esav would go out and do whatever he did in the world. Yaakov would be sitting and learning, and they'd work together. And what one did was support the other. So, you know, one would be much more in the world. You know, even these days, it's something we aim at, right? You know, somebody can go to work and then they come home and learn. A man can go to work and come home and learn in the evenings. Okay, and that's fine. That's putting the two together. But some people are going to just sit and learn, and everyone benefits each other. Didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because Esav didn't realize the benefit of what he was doing. And when you don't realize, again, it's a different share talking about Esav's self-esteem and his mistakes. So we're going to make it very quickly. But the short version is what was going to happen was Yaakov's going to be the more, I hate saying spiritual, the more focused more on the Ruchnias with a bit of Gashmias. And Esav was going to do the Gashmias infused by the Ruchnias. And that's why the first bracha that Yitzchak gave to Yaakov, thinking he was Esav, is a bracha, a Gashmias bracha. It's a bracha of having dew and wine and things you need just to manage in the world. Whereas Yaakov's bracha, we don't have in detail, but the assumption is that was going to be more Ruchniistic. When Esav, right, now we go back to Rochel and Leah, because we were going to. What happens? Esav leaves it, so he sells his bachira. Interesting fact, the word bachira means firstborn. Look at the letters. Base is 2. Chaf is 20, ignore the vav because it's inconvenient, and also it's only about, right? The root, the shayresh, the root of the word is all multiples of 2. 2, base 20 is chaf, and resh is 200, right? Because the bachar is the beginning of that being involved in the world. That's why the bachar gets double inheritance, right? Because they're the beginning of the world. So what was going to happen when Esav sells that bachara, what he's giving up is the role of the one who engages with the outside world, as well as with the Ruchnis, the role of the person who kind of straddles that divide. And he's given that up now. And now we have a problem because Yaakov's now got both. Why is that a problem? Because we have a concept like this. Each of the avos has a wife who's the complement, not compliment by saying, oh, you're very nice. I'm sure they did that too. Compliment in the sense of like, you know, the one that goes with it, like the jigsaw pieces. So for example, Abraham, who had mid of kindness, of chesed, had a wife, Sarah, who was much more on the side of din, of seeing things with that kind of clarity. Yitzchak has the midah of gevura, which is a midah of self-control. Rivka has a midah of chesed that counterbalances that. Now, what's supposed to happen, ideally? Esav, who is the outside, and he's a wife who is going to focus more on the inside. And Yaakov, who is the inside, is going to have a wife who focuses more on the outside. So theoretically, we're told, the Midrash tells us that Leah sat at the crossroads and listened to listened to all these people running around, going, this one's going to marry this one. Rachel's going to marry Yaakov, and Leah is going to marry Esav, and she's crying because she doesn't like it. And we've got to wonder what was, for goodness sake, you don't have to listen to everybody who's running around rabbiting about things. What she was so worried about? What she's worried about is because there's a truth to it. Because really, that first, Leah's eyes are tender, meaning she's looking inwards. That's her strength, is to look on this, the ruchniya side of things. Rachel is beautiful of outward appearance because her strength is working in the world. So on a very deep level, Rachel and Leah are recognizing there is an MS to that. There's an MS to what all these people are saying that Leah's supposed to, you with me? Leah fits Esav, and Yaakov, and Rachel fits Yaakov. But when Yaakov takes both the roles, what's going to happen? They've both got to marry Yaakov because now he needs both of them. With me? Okay.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. If Yaakov takes both those roles, if Yaakov has now got the role of Esav and the role of Yaakov, right? Meaning Yaakov is now got the job of the person who works with the world and the outside world, and also the job of the person who infuses the world with spirituality. Therefore, he needs both wives because you need one wife for each job. Right. Okay. So here's the thing. In that base, you with me? The question isn't who's going to marry Yaakov. The question is who's going to be the main wife. With me? So first Leah's crying because she thinks she's going to marry us, she doesn't like it. And she doesn't like it. Once they're on some level or other, Leah's recognizing it, Rachel's recognizing it, Lavan might not, but Hashem's got his ways of getting people to do what he wants them to do anyway, right? It's got to work like that on a deeper level. But the question is who's going to get there first? Who's going to be the main wife? Who's going to be the one who is the ancestor of Mashiach, who's going to be the ancestor of the Kohanim, who's going to be doing all that, and who's going to be the one that's, like we said, not going to be buried with Yaakov, and who's going to be on the way. That's our dilemma. Okay, so far, yeah, good. Do you want me to pause? Questions, queries before we carry on?
Yeah, what about Bilah and Zilpah?
What about Bilah and Zilpah? Really good question. Honest truth is, I don't know the answer, but the short version, I'll deeply answer. The short version is that each one of those it kind of goes with, because they're the maidservants, right? So Bilah kind of goes with Rachel, and Zilpah goes with Leah. But their roles were slightly different. That's why their Shvatim tend to, are called the lesser Shvatim. But yes, you're right. It's a really good point, and they were very much tiniest in their own right. Okay, but when we're talking about seeing who are the mothers of all of Klal Yisrael, it doesn't have to be a direct line. We're all considered children of Leah, and we're all considered children of Rachel. Now that doesn't make sense. You can't possibly be children of both. They were two different people having two different Shvatim. But because the midas that they had, and the amount that themselves they kind of sacrificed and threw into being the wives of Yaakov, mean that effectively we're all their children in two different ways. So we all say Rochel Imenu, even if we're descended from Leah, which I think, and even though if you're from a family of Kohanim, for a fact you're going to be descended from Leah, right? But it doesn't matter, we see ourselves as both. But it's a really, really good question, and I really have to be able to work that in next time. Okay, let's move on a little bit further. Okay. Let's talk a minute about silence, which I'm not very good at. Okay. Silence is not just not speech, okay? Like you can be silent and silence, okay? Let's talk about Rachel's silence, because she hands over the simony, she hands over these codes, and I mean that's a midrash, but even just the basics of the pasuk, she doesn't say anything. She's notoriously, incredibly absent from the whole thing about their wedding. The Lavan marries Leah off, and you wake up in the morning and it's Rachel. She or even if you don't look at the marriage, just take the pasuk as the pasuk. She has been quiet. She hasn't said anything, and we are told that it is that merit of silence. We'll go into it a bit deeper in a minute. That merit of silence, which has been there in Rachel's descendants and has saved us ever since. So the Chazal bring the example of Binyamin, who was Rachel's son, and he knew that Yosef had been sold into Egypt, and he didn't say anything. He gives the example of Shalom, and of King Shaul, who knew he was going to be king, but hadn't officially been crowned king yet, so he didn't say anything. The final example of Esther, again descended from Rochel Imenu. She was told not to say that she was Jewish, and she didn't say anything. So we're seeing somehow or other this midah of silence, which is not what you'd expect from someone whose job is outward looking. All right, so Rachel's split something. She's taken on a midah, which should be, and if you think of silence, you think of it as quite an inside kind of midah. You're going to talk about inside and outside, right? Silence is about keeping your mouth shut, right? It's about not letting things go. If you think about talking, ladies, which I know I'm doing a lot of, okay, talking, if you have an idea, it's in your head. And as long as you're quiet, it stays in your head. It's kind of spiritual in that sense, right? There's nothing to it real. Once you actually go and do it, I know I have an idea to build a house, then I start building the house. Once I start talking about it, I've brought it into the outside world. It's gone from my head outside. So if we're going to talk about ways of doing things, it's not like one. Silence should be an inside minute. So it should be, you'd think it would belong to Leah. And the attribute of giving thanks and praising Hashem, you'd think would belong to Rochel, but then can you see how it switches to Leah? Because one of the things we learn from Leah is the mitzvah of giving thanks, right? Leah has, when Leah gets her fourth child, she says, very famous pasuk, everybody likes to make a song about it, right? Hapam Aidel Hashem, today I'm going to praise Hashem. She calls her child Yehuda, which means to give thanks. We are called Yehudim after that. And that mitzvah of saying things out and expressing verbally how you feel out on the outside now becomes a mitzvah that we attribute to Leah. So everything's kind of switched. Can you see that? Okay. What's going on? Okay. Leah, okay, so again, Leah was going to be on the inside side. Now she's married Yaakov as that main wife. She's going to be among her descendants are the people who do that outside work with Ruchnius. So we know this, because also there's going to be two Mashiachs, Ben Yosef and Ben David. We're not going to go into that now. But the line of kings of Klal Yisrael after Shalom, David HaMelech, Shlomo, and so on and so forth. What does a king do? A king works with the real physical world, an ideal king of Klal Yisrael, works with the physical world, but does it in a ruchniistic way and always remembers who HaKadosh Baruch Hu is and represents that, okay? Now, all of a sudden, that's now Leah's role because she's switched, you with me? So that's what she's being the roles of the Kehanim, right? Kehanim do the karbanos, they do physical work in the Beis HaMikdash, but their job is the most ruchniistic job as well because it's teaching Klal Yisrael, it's bringing holiness into the world. They are all now coming from Leah. So her midah, if you like, what she's done is she's now the midah of speech, of saying things to praise Hashem, and that's what's coming out of her. Okay, she's thanking her. Okay, so now what's Rochel got? Okay, Rochel's got this midah of silence. And let's think a little bit. Remember how we said right at the beginning, we said Ruchnius is single things, and the more further away from that you get what the Maharal calls pirud, which means separation. Yeah, that's the further away from you're getting. The ultimate in period, in separateness, in not ruchnius, is being in galus. It does anything, any tragedies, and goodness knows we've had a lot of them that don't make sense. It's so separate. It's a struggle to even see a point to it. Can you hear me? Hear that? It's so pure, so separate. It's just everything's so fragmented. The Gemara says in when Mashiach comes, everyone's going to say God is one. And ask, well, what does that know? Manavi says that. The Gemara says, what do you mean everyone's going to say Hashem is one? We know Hashem is one now. We might know it in theory, says the Gemara, but we're not going to be able to see it because it looks like there's bad and good. We don't understand when we're in Galus, which we are in, why things are so muddled, why it's so confusing. It's the ultimate in separation. It's all, do you know what I mean by like fragmented? It's like if you I don't know, crack a mirror and try to look in it. It's all very bitty, right? And that is the point of exile. Rochel's midah of silence, even then, was this looks so unfair. It looks so unreasonable. It's incomprehensible. It doesn't make sense that that Leah should be humiliated, so she has going to give her this money. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that he can marry two wives, but one's got to be left behind. None of it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that Yaakov should have to leave home. It doesn't make sense that he should have to be in poverty. It doesn't make sense. None of it made sense. But she was okay to just keep quiet and say, look, I don't get it, but I know Hashem has a plan. I know there's one Hashem and he does have a plan, and therefore she was going to keep quiet. That's what's underneath all this fire. And when we look at all the descendants of Rochel, many that the Gemara talks about, right? Binyamin saw his brother Yosef was sold into slavery and gone to Egypt. He knew, he did, but Yaakov, he didn't tell Yaakov, he was a kid, he could have sold him. But Daddy, guess what? Don't worry, because yes. But he realized, he knew deeply that Hashem's plan, whatever it was for Yosef to go down, which look, again, that separation. And therefore he kept quiet, even though it didn't look like it made sense. It would make more sense to cry and yell and scream and make a fuss. It would make more sense to say what he knew. He was quiet because that was what Hashem wanted. Okay, Shaul HaMelech, again, same thing. He's told not to tell anyone he's going to be king. The people are crying out for a leader. They need someone to lead them into battle. This is, in the Navi, in Shmuel, right? They need somebody, but he's told wait until various processes happen. So even though it doesn't seem to make sense, and it would make more sense to just get on with it, Hashem says, leave it. I know what I'm talking about. So he's quiet. Esther is in the middle of the biggest gullus, you know, huge gullus. Everything's going wrong around her. She's told to keep quiet. It doesn't make sense. We don't understand. We're in exile. This is happening, threats left, right, and she's quiet because there's an acceptance that I haven't got a clue what's going on, but I know that there is a plan. This plan up there, and therefore I'm quiet. That's the mitzvah of Rochel. It's not. I mean, on the deeper, on a basic level, yes, of course, it's this mitzvah of just not embarrassing people. On a deeper level, it says Rav Golbech, the mitzvah of being quiet is about accepting that when we say things, where we could be, not always, we can be causing further fragmentation. We could be making things worse, and the depths, the real depth, which I certainly should be working on a lot more, is of being quiet. It's not an angry quiet. It's a I don't have what to say about this one, and I don't get it, so I'm just going to not say it. Okay, that's Rachel's mitzvah, and therefore, right, and therefore Rachel Imenu, although I guess numerically, right, she had 2 sons, and between Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, they had all the rest of the Shvatim. Okay, numerically, she might not be everyone's mother, but we call her the mother of Klal Yisrael. Okay, especially she's seen as the mother of Klal Yisrael when we're in Gullus, right? She's buried on the way. When the Jews, almost you cried this midrash, right? Okay, when the Jewish people are going out of Eretz Yisrael, they're being sent into exile, into Gullus, and they're going past her cave. But at some level, she knew she had to be there. Let's talk about she has to be there, right? She says to her, and because this is the place where Klal Yisrael most of was starting to see that separation, that not understanding, that fragmentation. There's no Beis HaMikdash anymore. They're separated here. They're no Eretz Yisrael. Everyone's separated here, then everywhere. Everything's sort of, you know, it's not understandable. And so therefore, when Abraham Avinu says to Hashem, I did this, that, and the other, Hashem can say, okay, well, that sukkos is used up already, because that was a very high level. Same with Yitzhak and Yaakov. What Rachel says, it doesn't even talk about sukkos. She doesn't do that. She says, here's what I did. She said, when I was alive, she says, you know, we said that the Midrash says, I kept quiet, so why can't you? I wasn't jealous of my sister and you're Hashem, so why aren't you jealous? And we said that's quite a sort of an easy thing to say. What do you mean? Of course, Hashem's not jealous. On a deeper level, one of the many ways of understanding it, excuse me, is this. She says, I kept quiet, even though it made absolutely no sense. It was the ultimate in separation. There was supposed to be one husband and one wife, and now there's one husband and 2 wives. There's been all, we knew it was going to lead to arguments. There's all the rivalry between the tribes. All we could see going forward is one piece of fragmentation after another. It didn't make sense then. It didn't make sense. But you know what? She said, I just trusted that Hashem is one. I trusted that you know what you're doing. You meaning Hashem, you know what you're doing. I trusted if this is the way you want it, then I would, and I was quiet. And therefore, she says to Kadosh Baruch Hu, she says, she says, you're a Kadosh Baruch Hu. You knew, she said, that you put Klal Yisrael in a world of periods, in a world of fragmentation. It's you, like the odds, is that the word? The odds are against you, is that the phrase? The odds were against us before we started. Right? You put us in the world with the Yetzer Hara and you're expecting us to manage. You're putting us in a world where you can't always see the truth of Hashem and you're expecting them to manage. You're putting them in the world that Klal Yisrael in the world of Nisyonis. There's one trial, there's one test, there's one challenge after another, and you're expecting them to hang on. That's if I could be quiet when I didn't understand and I didn't make the rules. She says, you made the rules, you made the situation. If I could be quiet with that one and I could accept it, you've got to accept it too, because you put them in this mess. And you know that there's an end in sight. They haven't got a clue. They're hoping and they're trusting, but they don't know what the plan is. You, Hashem, you see that all the pieces are going to come together. Klal Yisrael don't know that yet. They're just trusting. And therefore, she says, therefore, and they say that, if I could be quiet when I didn't understand, you, Kadosh Baruch Hu, who do understand, because after all, it's your plan, right? Then you can also accept them where they're holding. And therefore, Hashem says, okay? Hashem says, you were quiet when you could have been angry. You could have been angry. You could have yelled and screamed and raved and shouted. You could have chosen to embarrass your sister and just said, well, Hashem, try and get things done another way around. Why do I have this stuff? You could have done any of those things. You could, man, you've been really justified, right? It's quite reasonable for Rachel to have been very, very angry, upset, irate, frustrated, all of those things, right? But you were quiet. And then the pasuk says, it's very famous pasuk, Hashem says, stop crying. What's Hashem really saying? And underneath that, he's saying, you were quiet when you had every right to cry. So now I am telling you that you're going to be able to be quiet again. The last time you were quiet and you accepted and you didn't understand, and next time you're going to be quiet, because I'm going to show you that there is a way to understand, that they are going to come back and we are going to put all the pieces in the right place. And therefore you don't have to cry, because that last silence is not going to be a silence of, okay, well, I don't get it, but I'll be quiet, which is a huge big mitzvah, right? But the fight that ends of silence, that not crying, but Ezras Hashem any day soon, it's going to be the quiet saying, oh, I get it now. And that's Hashem's promise. Okay, it says, you two got it. At the moment, we have to accept when we don't understand. We haven't got a clue, ladies. It is just too hard. But what there's a chus of Rochel and the chus of Leah is the one we get to eventually, the one we will be able to thank Hashem. I mean, we do anyway, but to really thank and to really understand it. And with that, that's a chus of Rochel to be able to say, but I didn't get it before, but now I already see it, and therefore I can stop crying. Bim here up your medium any day now. Hashem. Right, we have about what, 5 minutes for questions? Anybody there? Or they've all gone to sleep on there. Hey, Cash. Yes.
Have you got any questions?
Questions, queries, comments, contributions?
Like if someone keeps silent when it's Hashem rewards you.
Yeah.
So I guess is this where it comes from?
Well, there's a lot of sources, right? So let me just repeat that. I know you asked me before. So somebody said, is this the source for the concept of being of having a reward for silence? Was that the right? So I don't know. It definitely is one of the places we learn. And the other place we learn from is Aaron HaKohen, who suffers a very tragic bereavement in the Torah. And the pasuk says, "Vayidam Meir," and he didn't know what to say, so he just kept quiet. And because of that reward, he gets an extra mitzvah. But yeah, this is one of the places where we learn that you know, if you don't get it, stop talking about it, kind of thing. Right.
Speech is gold,
Yeah, that's the one. Other way around. Not always, right? And that isn't, by the way, this is the therapist in me, just a sort of what's the word I want? The small print on the bottom. This does not, ladies, this is really important. I'm glad you raised that. Please, please, please don't turn off or go away until you've heard me say this. This does not mean that it's the Jewish way to do this whole stiff upper lip English thing. Okay, that is not what we're saying. Okay, we have a place when anything goes wrong to talk. We're supposed to do that. We don't, you know, when the reason we have, I don't know, chas v'shalom shivers and things is because there's a space to talk. But what we're hearing from Rochel, and she does talk, by the way, we're hearing from Rochel is the being able, and it is a very, very hard thing to do, being able somehow to accept that we don't get it, to accept that we have no idea what is going on, but that Hashem will. But I just want to put in that very, very clearly, this is not saying that if somebody's upset or sad or miserable or crying or needs to talk, that they come up to us and say, I need to, you know, and they really need to talk, then our job is not to say, well, you know, really, you should just be quiet about it, because this, and be like Rochel, and like, don't do that. Okay, that is not the point. The point is, of course, we give people a chance to talk. But there's another aspect to just like being able to be okay with things not being okay for the time being, right? So I just had to put that in. I'm glad you raised that.
And also you mentioned about that the share topic was the title was going to be about Sister Leah.
Yes.
You've not mentioned about two sisters or how they managed about it or everything.
Right, you're right, I didn't, and I did say there was an apology at the beginning, which is that when I sort of started when I make a share, ladies, what I do is I kind of like, it's almost subconscious, is what do I need to hear, right? So obviously I need to tell myself to be quiet a bit, but like I said, Mrs. Wilson's so extremely organized, she wants titles for me very far in advance, so I thought, okay, let's do that then. And when I came to it and I was thinking about it, I thought, no, you know, actually I want to go over here, so I guess I'll have to just wait. Oh, you can tell us yourselves, how do you think they did manage? We don't hear a huge amount about it till next week's parasha, actually.
I think they managed very well. If you think about it, they lived at each other's houses, they were married to the same man, there was no, you know, no generation would have happened, and Baruch Hashem, like we see, like to the point of yours on the pit, all the siblings got on, all the children got on. It's as they don't, you know, you do have family, you have proper arguments and serious people don't know and everything, you know. And I think the fact that they were such on a high level to accept each other's concern to go with them on their journey, obviously they did manage.
Right. Yeah. Again, it's quite a complicated thing, and a lot of it comes into next week's parasha as well, about how they all manage. And there are points, for example, where you get that kind of, you know, who's going to spend the night with Yaakov and all those discussions around that. That's definitely true. But I think also you can definitely say that when you knew, as they knew, that there was a purpose and a point to it, it presumably made things slightly easier. Presumably there are points, you know, we look in the past where, you know, there is, you know, human nature coming out and people's feelings, and, you know, who's going to be important, who's more important, less important, who feels loved, who feels, you know, who feels slightly less loved, only slightly, but we do definitely see that coming in as well.